Hello, welcome. This is the first of our supplementary video lectures that accompany our course, English 222, American Literature to 1865, or American Literature to the Civil War. In this video and the next that follows, we're going to talk about some of the earliest selections of American literature that have been assigned for this course. And we are also going to be doing some key literary reading skills that will accompany both of these texts. And that's going to be an ongoing theme throughout these videos. It's not just that I'm going to come here and talk to you about the texts that have been assigned for our course, but we will also be doing the skills that you'll be expected to do in the writing assignments, in the discussion assignments, in the journal assignments related to our class. And we'll also be talking about some key concepts in literary interpretation or literary appreciation, and how I thought we could handle these early readings and these first two lectures would be to talk about the Native American oral tradition and what's called the literature of settlement and conquest through the lens of some key attitudes that I think you'll want to keep in mind as you are approaching the texts in this course. So in this first video discussion, we're going to be talking about the Native American oral tradition. For all of these lectures, if you're watching this and are not enrolled in this specific class, we're using the Norton Anthology of American Literature. This is Volume A, beginnings through 1820, and for the specific semester that this course is occurring within, we're using the 10th edition of the Norton Anthology. So all of the readings that will be referred to will come from the Norton Anthology or will be provided as supplementary links in the video description below. The Native American oral tradition is rich and it is varied and it is fascinating and wonderfully complex and dynamic. One of the key differences between a lot of the literature that we'll be reading in this course and these specific selections is that they come out of what is called the oral tradition. Many cultures, especially those before the advent of writing, had what we might think of as comparable literature, but it was handed down generationally through actual storytelling, oral storytelling. And so the text itself might change over the course of generations, as stories are wont to do, or the text might be embellished by one storyteller, or certain details might be emphasized. We know that most cultures had a rich oral tradition that preceded the adoption of written language, and that some of the most famous works of Western, Eastern, American, African literature all originated first in the oral tradition. One of the things that's interesting about the selections that come from the Norton Anthology is that they are not contemporary renderings of Native American creation narratives or creation myths and creation stories. The selections that are provided in the anthology come to us from writers who published works in the 1800s and also in the 1900s, capturing or preserving in a written form the narratives that were passed down generationally. That's, I think, one of the most important things for us to consider here at the start of our course, is whenever we are approaching a text, we need to think about the text contextually. So a text is simply any sort of artifact that can be analyzed and studied. We use the word text even in reference to things that are not writing. So, this t-shirt is a text. A painting is a text. A film is a text. A statue is a text. A work of architecture can be a text as well. It's simply a placeholder for something that can be interpreted, something that can be studied, something that can be analyzed. When I speak of the context, we're talking about the historical moment that a work was produced within. What might have led the author or authors of the work to shape the story that fits a particular historical moment, or what might have been occurring at a historical moment that could have informed the story itself. Interestingly then, the Native American oral tradition stories that we're looking at in this course are shaped not only by their original contexts. In fact, some scholars believe the Navajo creation story might be among some of the oldest creation stories among humankind, perhaps dating as far back as the Neolithic or Paleolithic era, which would be significantly longer ago than most of the creation stories that we are aware of. It's not just the moment when the story is being produced, but it's also the moment that the story is being recorded. And how is its author that is recording it, or the author who is recording it, how is that person's context shaping the actual narrative? And you can see that in the note that comes, the prefatory note for the Iroquois creation story, where the editor of the Norton Anthology notes that the work began on assembling and capturing this text in writing during the time of the removal policies of Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson in the 19th century, that were set to relocate the Native Americans away from the East and the Southeast and into the interior of the United States. So how might the writer trying to capture the Iroquois creation story have been thinking about that historical moment as well? In other words, a text is really more than just the words that are on the page. It reflects a number of elements. And as we read, we should try to keep that in mind and always ask ourselves how something might think or might reflect the element that it was produced within. Also, of course, we should think about how it reflects our own moment, right? Because you're reading a text within your own context. And how you understand the text at the time that you're reading it can also shape or affect how you interpret the text. You bring your own personal histories, your own opinions, your own biases, your own presuppositions to every text that you encounter. For instance, both of these creation stories seem to have elements that appear to be echoed in other creation stories, especially those that you might be familiar with. I'm thinking here specifically about the Genesis creation account. That's part of the Hebrew Bible and Christian Bible. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the temptation of the serpent, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then of course subsequent elements in the primordial history of the Genesis narrative, such as the flood, and how those show up in both the Iroquois creation narrative and in the Navajo emergence narrative. Those are things that we want to keep in mind as we are reading, and we might be able to make connections between what we're reading and what we might already be familiar with. It's those moments of synergy, the connections that get made between a text that we're not familiar with and a text that we are familiar with, or a text that we're not familiar with, but the way that it seems to echo or perhaps have been the original cause of something else that we are later familiar with. Those are the things that we really want to be paying attention to as we're really trying to engage with the text itself. Let's talk briefly about the Iroquois creation story then, and we'll talk also about the Navajo emergence story. In doing so, I want to think about the text from sort of the 10,000 foot level, the basic arc of the narrative that's within, but I also want to get much closer to what's going on within the text. So in the Iroquois creation story, we have the emergence of these what's called an earth diver narrative, within the Native American folklore and creation narrative tradition. There are sort of two types of creation narratives among Native American cultures, and they include the version of somebody who sort of falls or dives downward and lands on a patch of land that then later becomes the earth that is inhabited, or those that seem to come up through multiple layers. That's called an emergence narrative. And we have a great example here with the Iroquois creation story, and also a great example with the Navajo creation story. In the Iroquois creation story, we have the emergence of somebody who falls out downward and is saved on the back of a turtle, a piece of earth that is provided on the back of a turtle that then is able to be expanded and welcome new creatures, new beings into existence. The interesting detail here is that the twins whom the woman gives birth to embody a sense of good and evil. And the emergence of good and evil at the same time is a detail that might intrigue us and make us want to think a little more about the relationship between good and evil, the paradigm that exists between good and evil in the narrative. Throughout the rest, then, we have a battle that is sort of existing between the good side and the evil side until we reach some sort of new state of balance or state of harmony from which then life itself is going to go forward. In the Navajo creation story, this is again an emergence narrative in which sort of the movement of the emergence narrative of an undeveloped entity moving through multiple layers until it reaches its final layer is of course symbolic of the birthing process, but perhaps meaningfully for the Navajo people, it's also symbolic of a migration process of people moving from one place to another. And we know that the Navajo people in the American Southwest moved into the American Southwest over time. And so the creation story could have connections perhaps with migration as well as the emergence of birth. And of course, creation stories can take on new meanings, of course, as a culture grows and develops. The narrative that is with this creation story involves a group who move through multiple levels until they are able to reach what is called the fifth world. That's this world, the earth that we are on now, and how they find peace and harmony and balance in the earth world, the fifth world that we inhabit today. I talked about reading in context moments ago, and I wanted to introduce a concept to you that might help illuminate how you understand something like the Navajo creation narrative. If you think about the values that a culture has, for instance, in the American popular imagination, we value concepts like liberty and freedom and equality, but we might always ask ourselves, liberty for whom? Freedom for whom? Equality for whom? And how does the author of a narrative understand the concepts of freedom and equality and liberty and justice and so forth? But I wanted to share with you an important key concept to the Navajo people. Hozhou, H-O-Z-H-O, with the accent marks on it, is a concept that means essentially balance, harmony. It's a key and important value to the culture. And so if it is a key and important value to the culture, we would do well to ask ourselves as we read or as we consider the narrative in recollection or coming back to it now for additional thoughts and analysis, how does a key cultural value get reflected in a text that is designed to explain where the culture came from? In other words, if this is a key cultural value, we might expect it to be a key theme within the work. A theme within literature is perhaps best summed up as the big idea. What is the idea that the text itself is really trying to put forward? Or what is the one sentence overview of the text that we are going to be taking a look at and trying to extrapolate? If you had to sum up the text in one sentence for the idea within it, how would you put that? And the way that you would put that probably gets close to the text's theme. So as we consider Hōjū from the perspective of a key value in the Navajo culture, then we want to ask ourselves, how does the tale itself capture balance and harmony? What does it have to say about balance and harmony? What is the argument that it is making about balance and harmony? Balancing what? Harmonizing what? Asking questions like this, once you've read or as you are beginning to read, is one of the great ways that you can get the most out of a work of literature. That kind of curiosity that you bring to a text is absolutely essential to meeting the text where it is and engaging with the text on its own terms. Reading literature is a conversation. You are conversing with author or authors over the distance of space and time. And before the advent of writing, we weren't able to communicate over space and time. All of our communication, if it was going to revolve around language, needed to occur in person. Somebody saying something to somebody else. Art existed, sculptures and paintings, but those needed to be interpreted. And on their own, they say something, but they say something less specific than written language can say. So the advent of writing has allowed us to have conversations across large gulfs of space and time. And as we are engaging in that conversation, like any good conversation, it's important to keep an open mind and to listen. And sometimes to be able to say, well, I didn't quite understand that. Let's go back and reconsider that. Surely at some point in this course, if not before this course, you've had the experience of reading a work of literature and you get to the end of a paragraph and you don't quite understand what it is that you just read. And you have sort of an option at that point, right? Do you give up? Do you walk away? Do you keep going without trying to understand? Or do you go back and try to reread the paragraph in order to really get out of the paragraph what you might need to get in order for the rest of the text to make the kind of sense that its authors perhaps wanted? When we talk about reading at a level, like reading a paragraph or reading at the level of the paragraph or the sentence, we're talking about a specific literary or critical reading style that's called close reading. We want to be able to look at a text and consider it at its building block structures. Sometimes the structure is just the word. And we might ask ourselves, what is the effect of that one word within the narrative? What is the effect of that sentence or that phrase or clause within the narrative. And of course, we could even take it at the level of a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs and talk about how words and sentences and images and symbols and metaphors and everything that's kind of captured in that paragraph are functioning, and how that helps us gain greater insight into the work of literature as a whole. Let's try some close reading together, and we're going to take a look at a passage from the Iroquois creation story now. And this is going to be at the start. Let's just begin at the start. We're going to jump around inside the story, but I'm on page 32 of the Norton Anthology, Volume A, 10th edition. And let's just start the story together and talk about what we notice in the story. Among the ancients, there were two worlds in existence. The lower world was in great darkness, the possession of the great monster. But the upper world was inhabited by mankind, and there was a woman conceived and would have the twin born. When her travail drew near and her situation seemed to produce a great distress in her mind, and she was induced by some of her relations to lay herself on a mattress which was prepared so as to gain refreshments to her wearied body, but while she was asleep, the very place sunk down towards the dark world. Just starting here, in the very first few sentences of this creation account, you may have noticed a few ideas or images. Note that the text tells us there were two worlds in existence, and that the woman in the narrative is pregnant with twins. So already in the first few sentences, we have twos showing up. That's a very not subtle symbol or signal to you as the reader that there's something about this text is going to be preoccupied with the idea of two-ness, two things together. Now, what might those two things together be? Or how might the two-ness of the text be manifested? Well, we have a lower world and an upper world. One is a world of darkness, one is a world of light. One is a world of monsters, one is a world of mankind. So our two-ness, or this binary that has been created inside the text, is falling along this idea of darkness and lightness. So as we continue working through the text, we'll want to stay alert for images of darkness or images of lightness or doubles or twinning or echoes, because all of those things have a sense of two-ness to them. As we understand that 2 is going to be an important number here, and we'll see in the Navajo creation account as well, 2 twos, or 4, is a key and central number. If you think about 2 as being an important number, then 2 of the 2 also becomes sort of a doubly important number. And we might think, what is the relationship between 2 things, and what is the relationship between 4 things? How are those different in the accounts that we have here? Turn to over onto page 33. Let's do another close reading passage from our creation story. When the woman goes into labor, she doesn't have a natural delivery. In fact, the evil twin, or the evil mind that is within her, he comes out unnaturally, and that leads to her death. And the narrative helps us describe or understand a little more than about where the elements of our world come from the good mind and the evil mind that escaped from her. The text tells us about halfway down the page, the good mind was not contented to remain in a dark situation, and he was anxious to create a great light in the dark. Great light in the dark world. But the bad mind was desirous that the world should remain in a natural state. The good mind determines to prosecute his designs, and therefore commences the work of creation. At first, he took the parent's head, the deceased, of which he created an orb, and established it in the center of the firmament. And it became of a very superior nature to bestow light to the new world. Now the sun. And again he took the remnant of the body and formed another orb, which was inferior to the light. Now moon. In the orb a cloud of legs appeared to prove it was the body of the good mind, parent. The former was to give light to the day and the latter to the night, and he also created numerous spots of light, now stars. These were to regulate the days, nights, seasons, years, etc. Whenever the light extended to the dark world, the monsters were displeased and immediately concealed themselves in the deep places, lest they should be discovered by some human beings. The good mind continued the works of creation, and he formed numerous creeks and rivers on the great island, and then created numerous species of animals, of the smallest and the greatest, to inhabit the forests, and fishes of all kinds to inhabit the waters. When he had made the universe, he was in doubt respecting some being to possess the great island. And he formed 2 images in the dust of the ground in his own likeness, male and female. And by his breathing into their nostrils, he gave them living souls. There are probably images, moments, or language in this particular passage that would echo elements of the Genesis creation account that you might already be familiar with. It's an interesting or worthy enough question to wonder how much of that is originally present in the Iroquois creation story, how much of that is an influence of Cusick, David Cusick, the man who's rendering this into English in the 1800s. But it's also interesting to point out some obvious differences from the creation account that you might be more familiar with. And on close reading, some of these differences prove to be really fascinating. Look, for instance, at what the bad mind wants. The bad mind was desirous, the text says, that the world should remain in a natural state. The good mind wishes to create, and by creating, he makes it better. He makes it more perfect. He adds more to it. But the bad mind wishes that it remain in its natural state, which is dark, dreary, and scary. This is sort of an inversion from the typical creation account as it's rendered in Western Judeo-Christian cultural values, where the world is created as perfection and descends into imperfection, or slides into the darkness, or slides into the negative. But in this version, what we start with is an evil, scary, bad, natural state that then is improved upon by people who come in and create and try to shape it and make it better. But notice too, on page 34, once the good mind is finished with his initial attempts at creation, the bad mind now comes in and creates. The bad mind does not exist solely to confound or to provide obstacles to a creator's work. The bad mind is also capable of creating The bad mind, while his brother was making the universe, went throughout the island and made numerous high mountains and falls of water and great steeps, and also creates various reptiles which would be injurious to mankind. But the good mind restored the island to its former condition. The bad mind proceeded further in his motives, and he made 2 images of clay in the form of mankind. But while he was giving them existence, they became apes. And when he had not the power to create mankind, he was envious against his brother. And again, he made 2 of clay. The good mind discovered his brother's contrivances and aided in giving them living souls. It is said that these had the most knowledge of good and evil. The good mind now accomplishes the works of creation, notwithstanding the imaginations of the bad mind were continually evil. And he attempted to enclose all the animals of game in the earth so as to deprive them from mankind. But the good mind released them from confinement, and the animals were dispersed, and traces of them were made on the rocks near a cave where it was closed. So we have this constant back and forth between the two. I'm going to create animals. I'm going to enclose the animals. I'm going to release the animals. I'm going to create things, the natural world, and it's going to be good, but I'm going to create things in the natural world that are dangerous. Mountains and waterfalls, steep cliffs that people can fall from. The world, then, is a beautiful place and also a place of danger, of trouble. It's both at the same time. And both the good mind and the bad mind are somehow working together to shape the world itself. And the tug back and forth of bad and good is what is providing a sort of meta structure to the world that is around everyone. It's also interesting when the good mind and the bad mind go to battle with each other, that the good mind wins the battle through lying. Both the good mind and the bad mind confess to each other what their mortal weakness is. It turns out the bad mind's confession is correct. It's true. But the good mind's confession is a lie. So that when the bad mind tries to use it against him, it doesn't work. So we have to ask ourselves, interesting moment. We don't necessarily have to have an answer to this moment. Your answer to this moment is your interpretation of what's going on inside the text. But what does it mean for the purposes of a creation account that good defeats bad through lying? Lying is seen as a conventionally negative thing, a bad thing, an evil thing. Does it mean good cannot win solely by being good? Does it mean there needs to be a leveling of the playing field between them? Is it a kind of naivete on the bad mind's part, not to lie? Is it a kind of cunning on the good mind's part to prevail like that? Is the good mind doing something wrong? In other words, ethically wrong? How might the original audiences of this story, in the Iroquois creation narrative, as this story would have been told within their culture, what might the original audiences have noticed or wanted to talk about? Sometimes I think that's really the key to analyzing literature, is taking a look at a text and being like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to you about this moment. That's the sign that there's a lot of energy in that moment, that your brain is sort of making connections and sparking by the things that you've read. That particular moment really fascinated me, as does the moment that shortly follows. The good mind gains his victory. And what we are told is, at last the good mind gained the victory by using the horns, as mentioned, the instrument of death, which he succeeded in deceiving his brother, and he crushed him in the earth. And the last words uttered from the bad mind were that he would have equal power over the souls of mankind after death. And he sinks down to eternal doom and became the evil spirit. Now, your footnote to this story, and the footnotes are really critical when you're reading along in the Norton Anthology. You always want to pay attention to the footnotes. The footnote says that particular event might reflect an awareness of a Christian belief in the devil as the ultimate evil spirit, ruler over the lower depths. So this is a moment where the text is sort of trying to draw your attention to this might be reflecting something else. At other points, such as in the Navajo emergence narrative, the footnotes will say something to you like, this predates, the story of a giant flood in the Navajo creation narrative is thought to have predated the earliest known versions of the flood narrative associated with the book of Genesis. So we want not to read anachronistically. To read anachronistically is to read outside of time, or to read backwards outside of time. The root word here is chronos, time, chronology. Anachronistically is the prefix here means not chronologically. If you read something like this and you say, well, yes, of course, the Iroquois creation story would have this particular moment to it, that's because the Genesis story has something in it. That makes a lot of suppositions that might not be true, such as, would they have known about the Genesis creation account? Are bits of information that are in this account reflective of Cusick as he's capturing it in the 1820s, or are they totally reflective of the narrative as it would have existed hundreds of years prior? Sometimes it's difficult to say, but we want to be on the lookout for moments like that. And when we're not sure, we don't want to make bold claims in favor of something when we don't know for certain. We can draw attention to it and talk about that it's kind of interesting and raises questions, but we want to be careful not to necessarily make bold claims about the text if we don't have the right information that goes along with it. Okay, let's take a look at some of the, let's do a little bit of close reading affiliated with the Navajo emergence narrative. This is the text when we might want to be really paying attention to the idea of Hoju, balance, harmony, as a theme. So how does this text deal with the idea of balance? How does it deal with the idea of harmony? Well, balance might be thought of in the sense of the two-ness, right? Two-ness and balance. We want things to level out and be equal to each other. But perhaps harmony is a reflection of a fourness around a certain idea. Something where all sides are in balance with each other. The crossbars of both are in balance with each other, and that's a kind of harmony. There's also a kind of harmony in terms of peace and especially the relations in the Navajo story between the sexes. We see lots of tension that arises in the story between men and women. We see sexual tension arriving in the story as they are in the earlier worlds. The people, as they are moving through in the text, it's the Dine, the people, the word means the people. The Dinae, as the Dinae are moving through the worlds, they keep getting kicked out of worlds because they keep committing adultery, or they keep engaging in sexual relations with the wrong people, or disrespectfully or inappropriate contact. And so we have a movement in this story from sort of inappropriate for community standards sexual relations to a balance between men and women that is appropriate. Not an anti-sex theme inside there, but trying to find the right balance of sex. Sex can be good. It can be loving. It can be rewarding. It can build intimacy. It can bring about children. But it can also be bad if it becomes a single preoccupation, or if it destroys relationships. If it becomes a matter of fixation, if it leads to affairs, if it leads to heartache and heartbreak. So we have a movement in the story toward sort of chaos, toward harmony. Again, the natural world, the natural existence is chaotic. The natural existence is immature, uncivilized. And the narrative is a movement toward balance, harmony, creating new frameworks that help create a positive world that can be lived in. Let's take a look, or a close read, at the narrative that describes the emergence of the first man and first woman, as they are called in the narrative. This is on page 38 in the Norton Anthology. On the 12th day, the deities returned. This is about halfway down the page. On the 12th day, the deities returned, bringing with them 2 buckskins and 2 ears of corn. Blue Body and Black Body carried 2 buckskins, one of which they laid on the ground. Yellow Body carried 2 perfect ears of corn, white and yellow, and laid them on the buckskin. The second buckskin was placed over the corn, and the Nilche Dinae were told to stand back, and the sacred wind entered between the buckskins. Again, we have a force of air that is doing the act of creating. That is similar to the act of creation in the Iroquois creation story, but it's also, if you're familiar with the details of the Genesis account and other accounts of the ancient world, the movement of air is associated with the advent of life. It's easy to see why the metaphor would be what is used, right? A living body breathes, a dead body doesn't breathe. So the movement of air is associated with life, and the absence of air is associated with death. Okay, sorry. As the wind blew, mirage people appeared and walked across the buckskins. On the 4th turn, there's that number 4, on the 4th turn, the ears of corn moved. When the buckskin was lifted, a man and woman lay where the ears of corn had been. The white ear had been turned into a man, and the yellow ear had been turned into a woman. They're called first man and first woman in the narrative. These were the first real people, 5-fingered beings, and they were made in the image of the holy people. The holy people then instructed these new people to build a shelter. First man and first woman entered the shelter and thus became husband and wife. First man was given a rock crystal, a symbol of clear thought, to burn for fire, and first woman was given turquoise, which represents the power of speech to burn. Thought and speech are complementary forces together. It's a kind of balance in between, right? And once they build the shelter and they enter into it, they become husband and wife, which I think we can look at here metaphorically as they become sexually united. In 4 days, a pair of twins were born to them. Notice again, 4, 2 and 2. And these first children were the Nodlii, those who have the spirit of both male and female. Only the first pair were like that. In 4 days, another pair of twins were born, and so on. In all, 5 pairs of twins were born to them. Now, 5's a difference than 4, but remember, one of the sets is the combination of the male and female spirit. And so we really have one of 2, each embodying 2, and a set of 4. So we really have 4 sets of twins and 1 set of twins that are also each 2s. It's just a nice way in which the literary structure of the story is developing an image. The image is being used repeatedly to sort of signal the way that things should be. A sense of 4 as a sense of completion, a sense of harmony. But the harmony continues to be disrupted. On page 39, there's a fascinating passage that has to do with an argument that the first man and the first woman get into. And it leads to a division of the sexes, sort of a rivalry of the sexes, where the men go off to be by themselves and the women go off to be by themselves. And the question is, who is going to be hurt the most by the absence of the other sex? I mention this for the sake of the narrative because the footnote at the bottom can be a little disorienting if you don't know more of the context around it. Essentially, the argument that the first woman and the first man get into is the first man goes out and he hunts. This is traditional of sort of agrarian cultures where the man is typically associated with hunting and the woman is typically associated with agriculture. And he goes out and he hunts. But she makes the claim, perhaps as a joke that gets taken very seriously, or not supposed to be taken seriously, but it gets taken too seriously. We all know how jokes can get kind of out of control, especially when you're teasing. But she says, well, the only reason that he really goes out and he does all of this hunting is because she rewards him with sex when he comes back. So maybe it's her sexual organs that deserve the credit for his hunting, because were it not for that, he wouldn't be as good at hunting as he is. And this sort of triggers something within him. It sets him off, maybe a sort of Paleolithic male insecurity. I'm not entirely sure. But it's a fascinating moment that sees the harmony of the relationship get splintered apart. And then the narrative has to bring this into resolution. They decide, for the sake of continuance of the people, that they have to reconcile themselves. And once reconciled, they're able to endure other challenges. One such challenge comes at the emergence of Coyote. Now, Coyote I don't think should be thought of as the actual animal. He's more like a divine force. But the coyote is a symbol that shows up frequently through Native American oral tradition as a sort of trickster figure. A figure that is deceiving people or tricking people in some way. And the coyote is the catalyst for what becomes the Great Flood. And it's a result of this great flood that the people are able to move or migrate out of the 4th world into the 5th world. That's going to be this world where they live. Where does the flood come from? Well, the coyote steals the children of a water monster. Again, plays a trick, deceptive. The coyote acts selfishly, and this is what leads to problems. Impulsively selfishly, playfully, without regard for cultural norms or standards or rules. And that's what leads to trouble. After kidnapping the water monster's children, the water monster gets its revenge by bringing a flood. And fortunately, they're able to assemble these reeds together that allow for essentially a ladder out of the fourth world into the fifth world, which is our own world today. But the coyote is not necessarily a force of evil or badness. Harmony, I think, needs a little bit of instability here and there in order for things not to get stale. And one of the more fascinating moments of this story involves the idea of where death comes from. This is on page 41. Finding the land to their liking, they proceeded to dwell upon it, planting fields and making their homes just as in the lower worlds. There were many people by this time, and they nearly filled the land. The holy people performed a test to determine their future. A magic shell was tossed into a body of water. If it floated, the people would live. If it sank, each person would eventually die. The object floated, and the people rejoiced. But then Coyote tossed a second stone into the water. It sank, and the people wailed. Then Coyote said, "If we do not die, we shall soon overrun the world. There will be no room for us all." The people saw the wisdom of his words and reluctantly agreed. This might be my favorite moment in the entire creation account here in your anthology, because I think it speaks to something really complex about human nature. Sometimes the things that are good for us are also the things that we don't want, right? If you've ever heard the phrase, too much of a good thing, you know that the absence of a good thing feels bad, but too much of a good thing is also a bad thing. It's about ultimately finding balance and harmony. Our natural impulse is to say death is bad. Death is an evil. Death is something to be feared. And perhaps because the coyote is affiliated with the trickster, it feels like the coyote is responsible for death, and perhaps literally is responsible for death, according to the narrative. But he's not recklessly responsible for death, right? If we do not die, we shall soon overrun the world. There will be no room for us all. There has to be some sort of force that allows for an ongoing sense of balance and harmony. And once the people understand that, once the people realize that if they lived forever, it would be bad for other people, bad for the world, they see the wisdom and reluctantly agree. And I love that adverb there, reluctantly agree, right? Because it's not necessarily like they say, you know what, Coyote, you're 100% right, and I enthusiastically agree. It is the sense, as we know, too much of a good thing often is a sense of reluctance, right? My favorite ice cream in the world is called Graeter's. It's a Southern Indiana, Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky company. I think it's based out of Cincinnati, actually, Graeter's, and they sell it in the supermarkets down here in Southern Indiana, where I live and teach this course. and they have an ice cream called Mocha Chip. And it's rich coffee flavored ice cream. And it is the only ice cream I have ever come across that like somehow gets chocolate chunks right. They're not like so hard you would crack a tooth trying to eat them. Somehow, even though it's frozen, the chocolate chunks immediately start to melt in your mouth. I'm getting kind of saliva buildup. I'm salivating at the idea of having some of this Mocha Chip ice cream right now. I love it, but I will tell you, too much of it is not a good thing, right? Now, if you'd say to me, you need to stop eating that ice cream or you're really gonna get a stomach ache, I will reluctantly agree with you because I so wish I could keep eating it. But I know I need to stop. And that's the feeling that I get here. There's a reluctance to agree, but a sense that harmony and balance sometimes require things of us that we don't necessarily want, but we know intellectually we need. The last portion of the story that I really wanted to focus on here is a character that's introduced in the final paragraphs of the story. This is Changing Woman. Now, Changing Woman sort of stands in as a Mother Nature figure. And it's through the work of Changing Woman that they're able to enter a new period of prosperity. Changing Woman is described in the text at the bottom of page 42 as the most beloved of all the deities. And I think that says something. It's an interesting juxtaposition to a lot of polytheistic religions where the top deity or the most beloved deity is male. In this context, the most beloved deity is Changing Woman, or an embodiment of sort of Mother Nature. And it's through her ultimate relationship with the sun that a world is going to emerge in which, after all of these struggles and all of this chaos, a kind of balance and harmony is able to be achieved. And the closing lines of the emergence narrative, I think, help show this. Lastly, a sacred rainbow was placed around our homeland for protection and as a blessing and a reminder of the sacredness of this land. It is said that as long as the Dene remain within this boundary, we will have the blessings and protection of the holy people. So long as we remain within these boundaries, we will be living in the manner that the holy people prescribed for us. So again, the ending here is sort of an inversion of the classical Genesis creation account, where we have a movement not from the perfect to the imperfect, but a movement from the imperfect to more perfect. And I really like that idea as a closing out for this first lecture of our online course to help guide your reading. In the same way that when I teach American Lit 2, I like to start with the poem by Emma Lazarus that's at the base of the Statue of Liberty as sort of a guiding text for the class. I want you to think about the end of the Navajo creation account as a guiding text for this class. Because so much of American history, and it's captured in the literature that even far, far, far predates the creation of the United States of America. So much of American history captured so well in the opening lines of the Constitution to form a more perfect union. Not a perfect union. Perfection is not possible. But through awareness and growth and development and an expanding sense of whose voices need to be heard, America had the capacity and has shown the capacity and can have still the capacity to become more perfect for its citizens. And the movement here from a chaotic world to a more perfect or more balanced or more harmonious, always precarious. There are always going to be obstacles along the way that stand the risk or that stand the chance of fracturing, that risk tumult and disorder and chaos. But through perseverance and through trying to reconcile the intellectual side of life, we can move toward the more perfect. That was embodied in this story hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years before the Constitution was created, depending how long this aspect or this component of the story can be traced back based on scholarly hypotheses and conjectures. But I think there's something really achingly beautiful in the idea that we don't go from the perfect to the imperfect and we just try to endure in the imperfect, but instead we go from the imperfect toward the more perfect. And together, if we work there together, as this story implies, we can continue working toward it, protected by the values and the bonds that hold us together. Thanks for joining this first of our virtual lectures, taking a look at the Native American oral tradition. And we will pick up these preliminary and essential reading skills in our next discussion of the literature of settlement and conquest.